It's G from the Academy, and I have the pleasure today of Zooming with Stephen Donovan, who is a studious analyst that I have followed for years across the internet. I guess I've kind of been stalking him and the information that he's been putting out because I've always found it to be accurate. Not only is he a studious analyst, but he also has the most amazing chair I've ever seen. Behind him there. Hey mate, how's it going and where are you at the moment?
I'm in Ukraine. Things are going well. Obviously, the world is undergoing this coronavirus lockdown, but fortunately, where I'm at, it's not particularly strict. So we can spend as much time as we want outside. And actually, during this time, I probably spent more time outside than normal because I've just been a little concerned that there would be some kind of more strict lockdown. So we've been spending about 5 and 6 hours outside every day.
Wow, that's amazing. What do you do with your kids outside for 5 or 6 hours a day?
Lately, I've been really into kiting. I've been trying to learn how to like kiteboard and things like that. So I have about a 4 meter kite, and I've been learning to navigate the kite in the wind. So it takes a little while to, it's like driving a car
Mm.
that you think that when you first get behind the wheel, you need to take these big turns and jam on the brake and jam on the gas. And then when you learn how to do it, you really use it like only your fingertips.
Mm.
So you have all this wind, but you have to control it just with very, very delicate touches.
Mm.
So it's
Mm.
kind of that process of going from barbarian to the artist, and it's really,
Oh,
really amazing.
oh yeah, and it must depend as well on the kind of kite that you have, because I imagine a lot of kites are just cheap and rubbish, right? And they're not really going to fly
Yeah,
properly.
I actually have two kites. I have one that's like a 4 meter kind of training kite, but then I also have like a 12 meter professional kite. So
Mm.
I'm really right now working on the doing everything with this trainer kite, and then I have my large
Mm.
professional kite, but I'm not ready to roll with that. It can be a little dangerous. The wind could just take you up and blow you away. It's
Could be
pretty,
fun. Could be
well, it's
fun.
pretty dangerous. It's amazingly, when you start really dealing with the wind, you really, it's like with the sea, you get a deeper appreciation for the power of Mother Nature, and you realize that
Mm.
it's not really something to play with. So a real 12-meter kite actually can kill you.
Wow, wow.
Yeah.
I I have the luck and the pleasure of having a view of the North Sea from where I am
Uh-huh.
right now.
Uh-huh.
There's a
Uh-huh.
beach out on my right, which is one of the top 10 beaches in the country. It's about uh it's about 2 miles long and it's about 100 meters wide, and at the moment the bridge is down, and there's
Mhm.
the only way to get to it is to wade through a river. Now you can imagine the average person is like, I'm not wading through a river to get to a beach.
Mhm.
Ridiculous. But when you get on the beach, it's yours and yours alone.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
right now from this window here I can see the biggest beach in the country and there's nobody on it, and
Well,
it's
I mean,
a
that's amazing. I love the water, but as you know, swimming in seas can have big waves and big currents, so it can also be
oh
amazing, but
yeah.
it can also be dangerous if you don't really know what you're doing.
Oh yeah, absolutely, absolutely. I've interviewed quite a few surfers recently, and we've been talking about how the kind of problems that they encounter. And also, I mentioned that because you mentioned the kite,
Mhm.
and because this area of the country is described as windswept, and
Yeah.
because it's really windy here, and
Yeah.
it's a great place to do kiteboarding out on the water. And sometimes I see the people out on the water kiteboarding, and it's God knows how fast they're traveling on those kiteboards. It looks like it's about 60, 70 miles an hour or something
Yeah, well,
like
that's what I'm saying. It can be dangerous because if you fall
that. Mm.
or if you get blown out too far, it may be difficult getting back. So it's a
Yeah,
long process being able to just
yeah.
maneuver the kite going out to sea, then coming back, because you can get blown out, and then you have to know how to get back going against the wind. So
Oh
it's
yeah.
a steep learning curve. It's one
Oh
way to
yeah.
go to take the wind and blow you out, but then you have to come back.
Well, that's what I'm thinking. Like, if the wind is blowing one way, then that's always puzzled me. I know it's
Yeah,
basic physics, right? But
yeah,
it's
yeah, yeah.
always kind of puzzled me. How
Well,
do
it's
you?
not so basic physics. I
Uh,
mean, it takes a while to learn that stuff. That's what I'm saying.
yeah,
So the
yeah,
whole navigating the wind and
mm,
takes a while to learn. It's not
yeah,
necessarily intuitive.
yeah. But there's a thrill. There must be a thrill when it all clicks together and
Oh
it
yeah,
works.
there's a complete. That's why I can be out there, as I said, for like 5 and 6 hours. You can just stay out there,
Yeah.
and it's pretty addictive.
Wow. Wow. That's so cool. Um, Hey, behind you, you got a massive bookshelf with a lot of books and papers, and
Yeah.
you've been reading a lot recently. What have you
Well,
been
I
reading
always
up
read. I
on?
mean, I've been reading all my life, so I read. I've read all
Yeah,
my life. So
I've noticed a couple of research papers and links that you've dropped
yeah,
on the
I
Facebook
read
thread.
probably at least a few hours every day of mostly medical or scientific text.
Yeah,
I've been doing it for a long time.
which gives you a great background for the present situation that we're in.
Yeah, because unfortunately these things were rather visible. This is not
Mm,
really much of a surprise. It shouldn't be much of a surprise to those who've been paying attention. The biggest surprise is the breadth of the operation, but not the operation itself, but the
uh-huh.
scope, the magnitude is pretty shocking. But what they're trying to do, the agenda, and particularly what they're trying to do in the United States, should have been pretty plain to see for a long time coming now. That should be absolutely no
Mm.
surprise.
Well,
The biggest surprise is that they can lock down the whole world, but not that they would lock down the United States.
yeah, the planetary level of the scale of the current predicament is breathtaking when we
Yeah,
look at
that's
it.
what I think is the surprise.
Yeah.
Everything else I think is not surprising at all. That you could shut down the entire aviation industry, that you could
Mm-hmm.
shut down the entire tourist industry, that you can
Mm-hmm.
immediately necessarily stop travel with, among countries and within countries is pretty amazing. That you could effectuate a kind of global lockdown order is pretty amazing. But I never thought it would be surprising that they would do all of those things in the United States.
Um, yeah, obviously there's a plan from my perspective. Obviously they know what they're doing. Bill Gates had his 201 pandemic exercise. How much do we know about that? Was that sort of a initiation program? Was that a sort of planning for how people are going to
No, that
react?
wasn't the number one. It wasn't even the first one of those events that took place in Johns Hopkins on global pandemics. The first one took place a year earlier and also had a global virus. So they were two run through simulations at Johns Hopkins with those same people. So the event 201 was just the second one of two.
Oh wow, wow, that's incredible. That's absolutely incredible that they're able to to run these in the background. Do you, do you think they ran these knowing what was going to happen, especially as
Yeah, of course they know what's going to happen. Yeah, I think there's no doubt that they knew what was going to happen. I mean, I think
and
they've worked hard for this to happen, just as if the same people worked hard for 9/11 to happen. So I think that if you recognize that 9/11 was something that was intended to achieve a certain objective, which was achieved, this is also something designed to achieve a certain objective that we're in the midst of, whether they will achieve it or not. But they have been rather successful in a large amount of what they've been trying to accomplish. So uh, these things don't happen by accident. And in fact, in the both of the events that were run at Johns Hopkins, the measures taken were not as stringent as the ones being taken now. They've actually gotten, so for example, they didn't quickly shut off travel between countries, international travel. They didn't do that, but this one they did. And in that mock through. They had up to 65 million people having contracted the disease, and I'm not sure how many millions died, but it was a pretty staggering number that they had estimated in their pandemic then.
Yeah, it reminds me of a story I heard about during the Second World War, or in the early parts of the build-up to the Second World War, when the Germans invaded Holland, that they were trying to get the Dutch on board with the German agenda, and the Germans were surprised that the Dutch went further with the German agenda than the Germans even went with the German agenda. Where the
Yeah,
Germans, the Germans suddenly realized that they didn't even have to persuade the Dutch to get on board. The Dutch just got on board anyway and just started,
well, the same
rounding
kind
up
of thing
people.
when you have people who are, of modest means or limited resources talking about how we need to stay locked down, and they're not even able to earn much of a living. So it's rather amazing the level of
Yeah.
a willingness to just adopt a ideology, particularly if somebody you dislike adopts a different stance. So right now there's this idea that somehow Donald Trump needs people to work to save the economy. So they're just bent on adopting the contrary position. Well, no, we need to stay home. When they themselves don't have anything to eat, they themselves are waiting for government checks. So it's just an amazing level of almost Stockholm syndrome, realizing that working is in your own best interest. Working is what people do to buy their homes, to buy their cars, to feed their
Mhm.
kids, to send their kids to school, to buy their clothes. And the idea that somehow a billionaire
Mhm.
like Trump, a billionaire, needs people to work is absurd, because if nobody works, he will still be a billionaire. He
Mhm.
doesn't need their money. He can ride
Mhm.
out this pandemic and the next pandemic. He never needs to, he's a billionaire. So the idea that people of modest means think that not working is some revolutionary act against a billionaire is completely absurd, when they themselves that they don't have money. And
Yeah.
this is the kind of binary situation we're in, where if Trump says, "Oh, we need to get back to work," the immediate response is, "Oh no, because I don't do what Trump says because I hate him because he has orange hair." And it's just the most asinine,
Mm.
robotic mentality that you can get, and so because of that, they're easily misled. So you have a guy on the other side like Andrew Cuomo, who is the governor of New York, who says, okay, we need to lock down the city. We won't open up until I say. And I think that we're going to stay locked down until we get the vaccine. They're willing to go along. They're willing to say, oh, he's against Trump. So yeah,
Mm.
we need to stay locked down, and we need to wait until we get to the vaccine. As if they've have any idea and ever looked at what vaccines do, have ever read a vaccine insert, have any understanding of what this larger agenda is, the same way that these same, idiots wanted to bomb Saddam Hussein for 9/11, when even by their own official narrative,
Mm.
Iraq had nothing to do with any 9/11, but they were on board. And so they're on board to this, but the consequences of being on board for this are much, much steeper than the consequences for being on board with 9/11.
Yeah, I think that 9/11 had its isolated areas of effect, although a lot of people in middle management across the world were really affected by that. I think that this on the global scale is quite frightening. The fact that if I just hop onto my local Facebook market page place, where people are just like buying and selling, exchanging secondhand goods, the old stuff that they don't need, and find that there's people on there right now saying that you're killing people by buying and selling. How can you possibly do that? You're encouraging people to engage in commerce and leave their homes. And there's people screaming and shouting about that, trying to shut down everything. And these are vital things that people need. There's old people that need fridges, they need food delivered to them. There's vulnerable elements of society, and people also need something to bloody do during a
I mean, the
so-called
whole
lockdown.
idea of this thing of non-essential jobs is just rather fascist and rather insane because anything
Hmm.
that somebody is willing to spend money for, they
Hmm.
think is essential.
Yep.
So
Yep.
if, I mean, are you going to tell me that a pair of shoes is not essential? So wearing a pair,
Mm.
if you want to buy a pair of shoes, maybe it's
Yeah.
important that you have a pair of shoes. So who's
Yeah.
to say that buying a pair of shoes is not essential? Who's to say buying a pair of pants is not essential?
Mm.
If you have a computer and you work from home, you are making your living on a computer and the computer breaks
Yep.
and you want to go to a computer repair shop, why is that not essential? So this whole idea that some bureaucrats
Mm.
who themselves are building nothing but writing laws, they themselves are not essential, are deeming other, I mean, what makes some politicians essential? What makes some guy who's writing a law essential? They're not essential. If you didn't have these people, these governors and mayors and things like that,
Mm.
people would still be fine. But they can deem that somehow, somebody who makes shoes or repairs shoes is not essential. If you want to get a haircut, why is getting a haircut not essential if it's something that makes you feel good about your own self-esteem? Just makes you feel good about yourself. Where does the line begin and end as to what's essential and not essential, other than this kind of dictatorial edict that
Mm.
you're good, you're bad, which is completely either communistic or fascist, whatever it is, it's purely authoritarian.
Yeah,
And
and how can somebody else know what is essential or non-essential for me and my family? Oh, that just boggles the mind, as they say. I mean, I'm just so uh, unable to comprehend that level of thought. Um, Also, the there's little bits from the news recently, like the members of Parliament in Britain giving themselves a wage increase and granting themselves an extra £10,000 to arrange their home office so that they can work from home.
yeah, well,
Meanwhile, everyone
that's
else
what I
is.
mean about this. It's a very much eugenics idea that certain people just aren't really fit to live and other people are. I mean, and when you understand this eugenic mindset that's been in existence for a very long time, then it becomes rather clear. The idea is that social Darwinism is a realistic model to organize society, and that you have people that just really aren't fit to live. And that's where this essential versus non essential dichotomy comes. Who is fit to live and who's not? And so the people who are not fit to live needed to be kind of ably assisted in getting pushed off the table for the better of the body politic. And those who are essential need to be rewarded. And that's where this £10,000, to rearrange your house and, pay increases come in, because you are deemed worthy and other people are not deemed worthy. They're not fit to live.
Crazy. It's absolutely crazy. And in an interview I did 2 days ago with a local businessman who had to who runs the second oldest company in Scotland, and they were forced to close down within 24 hours by the government of full manufacturing and running to zero production within 24 hours. In fact, the whole process, he said, took 2.5 hours. He said from start, he said, we went into a meeting, we came out of the meeting, said that was it was done. Yeah. And um and so you talk about essential and non-essential. They employ 1,000 people in the local community here.
Because it's about, as I said, a very authoritarian model.
They've
And the idea,
decided that the clothing that this company produces, which is considered one of the top companies in the world, is non-essential.
that's what I'm trying to say.
It's wild. It is so wild. And what you said about social Darwinism reminds me of the little comment that Bill Gates made in one of his speeches where, well, this is like death panels and we're not supposed to have that debate, where suddenly we're ignoring the vulnerable and the old members of society. We're basically saying, hey, old people stay at home, or as they have in Britain right now, signing the do not resuscitate papers when the people are going into hospital. And now it's coming out that old people who are going into hospital for mild problems are being encouraged to sign this do not resuscitate because the NHS is under such great stress and pressure, even though, according to Summit.News 2 days ago, 25% of the beds in the NHS throughout Britain are not filled at this moment in time because the people have taken a step back because they've been advised to or told to not to put too much pressure on the system which has been overstressed and put under pressure and had over the last 10 years over 50% of the beds removed across the country, and yet the government turn around and blame the people.
This is the same idea of eugenics and social Darwinism and destroying publicly accessible healthcare, because publicly accessible healthcare can extend life to vulnerable populations. And in a eugenics model, there's no need to extend the life of vulnerable populations. In a eugenics model, vulnerable populations should be the first one to get pushed off the table. So when you have the elderly, they do not need to be given an extended life. They needed to be kind of pushed off the table to get room, make room for the healthy, the intelligent, the better seed, the better fruit. So that's what is to be expected. So things like nationalized healthcare, things like publicly subsidized universities, things like basically access to high quality education up and down the scale, things access to high quality, let's say kindergarten or preschool services are things that go against the eugenic doctrine of no, we do not need to help these people. We do not need to give assistance to these people. And what happens, happens. And if they can't kind of cut it on them on their own, then they're not able to get on the bus. And so you have to pay your fare or you get off the bus. And the bus is basically the planet. And if you do not meet or satisfy a certain level of criteria, then and that's what's happening all along, is that many people are going to be economically starved, deprived of their opportunity to earn a living. Soon there's going to be food shortages, and that's going to leave another level of desperation and violence. Eventually there's going to be violence, and then it's an opportunity to use armed forces to react, to say we have to instill order. We can't let disorder come. So it's not really a surprise what they're doing. It's not a surprise as to what their objectives are. It's not a surprise as to what the immediate next steps are going to be.
Yeah, I've seen recently videos of, I can't remember which American governor it was, who said that we're going to reward snitches for
Yeah, in
provide.
California, the governor in California,
I mean,
Gavin
it's
Newsom.
how does it not register that that's not straight out of I don't know, communism or some kind of Stasi
No,
idea or
Nazism,
principle?
not cause, not all authoritarian governments is because, particularly in the United States, people have been so bombarded with propaganda, fascist propaganda, for a long time that then it is the next step. So you have particularly a lot of people, for example, reporting African Americans for very minor things. You had a situation where a woman called the police on African Americans having a barbecue, just having a barbecue, and calling the police, and it became and there were lots of instances of people just calling the police on African Americans. And so that mentality of us versus them, the in group versus the out group, just now is set in place. And then you can switch the out group, and then people buy into it. So one day it's black people, the next minute it's people who are, not black people, who are meeting and going and having a barbecue when you have a quarantine. So these were black people having a barbecue, no quarantine, but now you have not black people having a barbecue in a quarantine. So they also deserve the same treatment. And it becomes very easy to say, oh, we have a stay home order. Why are you out having a barbecue? You're violating the CDC recommendations. And then, so people have already been trained to view these binary in-group, out-group paradigms. And so you change the out-group and the relationship stays the same.
So eloquently explained and so readily visible in our communities around about us right now. I saw a quote recently which described that the concept of quarantine was only for sick people. And that or vulnerable people, and that quarantining the healthy people is slightly insane. It's kind of like locking up people who definitely haven't committed any crimes or something.
No, it is. But once again, in this kind of fascist paradigm where propaganda carries the way, repackaging, redefining, giving nice little terms to distort reality is entirely appropriate. So, of course, you use the term quarantine to mean something other than what it means. And so this same, for your safety is this kind of term where you're not able to work, you're not able to feed your kids, you're not able to practice your profession for your safety. Is kind of Orwellian, because it's not for your safety, or it's a certain level of paternalism to think that you yourself can't decide what is for your own safety or not. So if you think that you can go to work within this virus pandemic, but it's better that you go to work, it's for your safety to earn your keep, to practice your profession. But you have this other level of paternalism, of authoritarianism, to tell you, no, my little boy, you're not able to make that decision because you don't have the facts, because you're not an expert. So even now, even with respect to the President of the United States, you have the person who is elected to represent the country, the highest position in the land, is being told he doesn't listen to the experts, that he has the expert at his disposal and he's not listening to the experts. The person who is supposed to make those decisions as to balancing the relationships between health, safety, welfare, economics, is being told by this CIA directed, driven media that the president himself doesn't listen to the experts, unelected people, unaccountable people, saying one thing, that even when the president doesn't take their advice, somehow he's doing something wrong. He's acting like a petulant child. So what does that say about the concept of democracy? If you believe in a democracy and these people have elected this guy who's supposed to be your leader, he's supposed to be the one making the decisions. He's supposed to get the counsel of experts, but the decision rests in that person. So he can listen to the doctors, but he can also listen to the economists. He can also listen to whoever he wants to come up with a decision. But in this, what I would call the scientific dictatorship that's being set forth, the experts, the scientists, Trump politics, Trump everything. It's that there's supposed to be this doctrine of science that's presumed infallible, and that if you don't listen to it, you're some kind of heretic, even when by their own metrics, they misstate, misrepresent, overshoot the damages, the harm that's going to come from their projection. So 1 minute, they project 2 million people are going to die, then it's 200,000, and then it's 60,000. But somehow, the doctrine of science remains relatively infallible. And mere mortals, like a president of the United States, can't challenge that orthodoxy.
Oh, absolutely. There was an expert from a British university. I can't remember which one. I don't think it was Oxford. It was, I think his name was Neil Ferguson. I made a post about it a while ago, where he advised the British government there were going to be 200,000 deaths within the next month if something wasn't done instantly. So the government takes the advice of the experts and begins to impose certain elements of lockdown. Then the day after the lockdown, he revises all his
Yeah,
figures
that's what I
and,
mean. That's what I'm trying to say is
numbers.
that, for example,
Just changes
this
it.
has happened all the time. So whether it's him or whether it's Anthony Fauci, all of these people have revised their apocalyptic uh, prognostications. All of them made incredibly apocalyptic prognostications to get people to flatten the curve, and it would be a 2-week period. Once the virus gets under control, once movement was limited, and then they get the animals in the cages, and then they say, well, it might not end for a couple of years.
It's exactly the same principle that was encompassed in the George Bush speech, where we don't want the smoking gun to become a mushroom cloud. I mean, that's
Yeah, it's
it.
ruling by fear. It's
Yeah.
ruling by fear, and it's ruling through ignorance. So it's ruling by fear, ruling through ignorance. It's terrorizing the population. In fact, every year when you have these drives for flu vaccines, there's methods of how you market the upcoming flu season as being deadly. The buzzwords you use to frighten people to even get flu shots. And so this is now the same methodology being applied to this coronavirus, and it's applied on a global level of pounding death rate, fatality, and just terrorizing people to think that they can't go out of their house until the vaccine comes, begging for the vaccine, never having read a vaccine insert, never having known about the harms the vaccine cause, never having read anything about the reduction of certain pernicious diseases, but just taking it on blind faith that vaccines eradicated polio, vaccines eradicated every serious medical threat, and never knowing the decline of serious illnesses due to things like better sanitation and plumbing, not going to the outhouse, the caca, and all these things. So they're completely ignorant to that medical history because you're dealing with a reality that no industry has, in a sense, some of the uh, resources available that the pharmaceutical industry has, and the ability to kind of rewrite their own history. And that's what they've done, and they're doing it now in real time. So you have people thinking that you're going to get immunity through a needle, not from immunity through your own immunological defenses.
Right. Right. It's even hard to find an analogy for it, because when you when you study it, it becomes, the more you study it, the more absurd it becomes. So it's only if you distance yourself from the idea that it seems to have any any logic a lot of the time.
Well, I think it has a very, very clear logic, and unfortunately, the logic is one of eugenics.
Mm,
I think it has a very, very clear logic. I don't think it's surprising.
mhm,
I think it's incredibly predictable. I think it's everything they're doing is incredibly predictable. So I think that the problem is that people have allowed themselves to be so dumbed down, to be so to have transferred responsibility for their own health decisions to the experts, that just as the popularity of religion, they have completely given over that sense of responsibility to others, listening to the priest, listening to your pastor, listening to your rabbi, listening to the pope, whatever it is. They have no agency in their own health decisions. The doctor, I listen to the experts, the scientists, and not even thinking. I had a friend of mine, uh, you know, essentially calling me an idiot because I don't have a medical degree, even though I've looked at these issues necessarily related to vaccines for over 20 years. Over 20 years I've read, and I have a library of medical books, articles that is huge. But
yeah.
just because I haven't jumped through that hoop
Yeah.
of having a medical degree, that 20 years of knowledge that I have, the library full of books means absolutely nothing because I'm somehow some conspiracy theorist when
Mm,
I could go from book to book to book to book to book and have a discussion that's rather irrefutable, but that means you have to take it seriously and actually have a discussion on the merits. But when you get to this religion of blind faith, then you're an idiot. You don't know what you're talking about. You don't have a medical degree. Well, okay, maybe I don't, but maybe the books that I read, the people do. Maybe we can read what they're writing. We can read this page. If you understand the language, maybe you can read what they've done on this, and maybe we can conclude that what they're saying is right if you don't believe me. But no, it doesn't go there.
It's it's so true. I often come across that problem, and I think about it like, well, if you spend an hour, let's take a sort of extreme example. Let's say you spend an hour a day researching a topic. So at the end of a year, you're going to have 365 hours more knowledge of a topic than somebody who hasn't looked at the topic. Yeah, and if that continues over a period of time, then you're going to build up a wealth of knowledge. And people tend to want to rubbish what other people are saying as if it's some small victory without actually learning to properly listen. And we've been taken over in so many ways in this scientific reorientation of society. Just as one example, the actual term social distancing is, in my opinion, an oxymoron. To be social is to come
No,
together.
I agree. I agree. And I
To,
think that's what we're talking about in this fascist paradigm in this Orwellian fascist paradigm of taking terms and just mangling them to mean the opposite of what they should.
yeah, ultimate terror and fear becomes the new normal.
Exactly. And I think that, people unfortunately don't recognize the power of manipulation through fear. They don't recognize the power of fear. And
That's so
so
true. Well, wasn't there a documentary like The Power of Nightmares? I seem to
there
remember
was a
something.
documentary, The Power of Nightmares. It was like a 4-part documentary by
Was
a
that
guy
the
named Adam Curtis.
Adam
Adam Curtis.
Curtis? Yeah,
Hmm. Yeah,
yeah. That's a
yeah.
must. That's a must for you, level one. You want to get a grounding and where we're
Yeah,
at.
well, I mean, this is where, once again, the relationship between this pandemic or plandemic and 9/11 comes into play. Because, once again, what Adam Curtis talked about nearly 20 years ago was that politicians have nothing to offer the people anymore. There is nothing to offer except the freedom from the nightmare that they themselves create. So
Wow.
the freedom from the nightmare that they themselves create was the specter of terrorism. And oh, we're going to protect you. We're going to protect you. We're going to protect you from terrorism. And now they have nothing to offer. And now it's we're going to protect you from the coronavirus. So nobody's talking about education. Nobody's talking about really jobs, where they're losing jobs, they're hemorrhaging jobs. There's 22 million Americans who lost their job in a period of 1 month. 22 million in
Yeah.
1 month. So, but they're not talking about jobs. They're talking about there's nothing left other than we're going to protect you. We don't know when we can open up. We don't. And so it's just that there is zero. The dichotomies now are more stark than ever between those people who are doing extremely well financially and those who have nothing. The unwashed masses who have nothing and who aren't going to get anything. You're not even promising them anything other than now we're going to protect you from this virus. We're in a war. We're in a war against an invisible enemy, an unseen enemy. So we're gonna defeat this enemy. And it is so childish. It is so paternalistic. And people don't recognize the dynamics of that dialogue, rendering them into helpless child. Papa's gonna take care of you and protect you from from this scary thing. And whether you want to work or not, no, because we know that it's too dangerous for you yet. We don't know when you can go outside. But right now we know it's really scary and it's too dangerous. And even if you feel good, even if everything is fine for you, even if you feel great, this invisible enemy is going to kill those around you. It's going to kill your father or your grandmother or your child, somebody who is immunocompromised, who's not as healthy as you are. So even if you think you're fine, you're really not. You yourself are the danger because you might carry the virus and you don't even know it. And so it's just completely,
Yeah, the idea that even if you're okay, you need to follow this prescription. It's like, even if you're okay, you need to take the drugs. And it's like, what? And it does kind of reflect back to the idea that you highlighted the social Darwinistic element. And um, the phrase that's in my head is human disease. It's almost reframed people as a disease affecting people.
Of course. And that's what social Darwinism does. It suggests that there are certain people that are dragging us down as a species. Historically, it was the alcoholics,
Mhm,
the prostitutes, the homosexuals,
mhm,
and the perennially poor. They're intergenerationally poor, were feeding on the host. They were the kind of the parasites on the host. That if you got rid of these prostitutes corrupting our social norms, you got rid of this intergenerationally poor who just grew up in these ghettos, who learn how to rob and steal and cheat. Get rid of the homosexuals who are not procreating, not adding to the number. And of course you had the racially defective who by their nature, by their race, did not have the capacity to be intellectually at par with, let's say, the white race. And even within the white race, you had the darker white races, the Slavs, the Italians, who, even though they were white, they were tainted by this darker hue and weren't intellectually at the level of, for example, the Nordics, the Scandinavians. And so these machinations have played themselves out in different ways, but the basic paradigms are still in place today.
It's wild. It's wild. Um, do you see it ramping up and continuing from this present moment in time, or do you see it easing off slightly?
No, no, it's this is now the war. I mean, they told you we're in a war, and we are in a war, and so they're putting pedal to the metal, and they're, as I said, they're not letting the animals from their cages. They're gonna have food shortages. They're gonna increase the repression. So of course that this is the time they've been working for. This is that moment. This is that moment when we can push the people off the table. We can push them off. So there's no reason to, the only way that there can be resistance is if there is actual resistance. There is not going to be any resistance or any let up from their part. The only way there can be resistance if people do something about it.
Right. So, what can we do as people? What can the average person
People are
do?
starting to wake up now. So they're, for example, just yesterday they had going out in Michigan and protesting in Michigan, going out in Berlin, Germany, going out and marching, going out in different places. You have to have people saying, no, we are not prisoners. We are not going to be prisoners. We are not afraid of your crony virus. We're not afraid of your crony virus. We're not afraid that people may get sick. Said 100 years ago, people had polio, people had yellow fever, people had malaria, they had scarlet fever, they had whooping cough, they had measles, they had mumps, they had all of these diseases, but they were still going outside and working and doing whatever they were doing. So whatever level of disease, the longevity rate was 15, 20 years shorter than it is now. And yet they were going out and doing their thing when the average age was 65 or 60, and they were still going out and living. And now it's, in the 80s for many places in the world, the most, in the 80s, your average life expectancy. So now we're supposed to be afraid. Now we're supposed to be afraid of disease when most diseases, because of not vaccine, but because of better hygiene and better plumbing,
Mm.
are living much longer without disease. Why do we need to be afraid now? Why do we need to be afraid now? Because you tell us that there's some killer disease, the same way that you told us there was going to be 40 years ago, there was going to be a killer disease, AIDS, that was going to depopulate Africa, it was going to wipe everybody out in Africa. It didn't wipe everybody out in Africa. Once again, the same guy, Anthony Fauci, running that fear campaign that didn't pan out like that. So he was wrong then. He's wrong now, but he's advocating this, using the same tactics of fear, and advocating, and this time he's going for even more, because now he's going, for the entire world with these vaccines.
Wow. I think that the whole concept of the whole situation is sometimes too big for people to comprehend. If there is one thing, because in my in my other life, I work in personal development with people, and I encourage them to change just one thing, however big, however small, change just one thing to try to create a domino effect within their
Mm-hmm.
life. Is there just is there just one thing you think that maybe people could do that might have a domino effect in terms of understanding or helping us out of this predicament?
Yes, they need to assert their fundamental human rights of being able to go out of the house when they decide. They need to fight back against this lockdown.
Mm-hmm.
That's the first act of resistance. Just fight back against the lockdown. Say, look, mister, you don't have you're a doctor, you're a politician, but the fundamental right that you have to decide whether I go out of my house or not is not yours to make. That I can look you in the eye and I can say, I'm not going to hit you, I'm not going to steal from you, I'm not going to harm you, but you don't control whether I go out of my house or not. You don't control whether I can earn my living or not. That fundamental level of intrusion, state intrusion, is not your right. You do not have that right. And if you can draw that line, then you've drawn a meaningful line. Other things will come. That if you cannot stop me from going out of my house, if you cannot stop me from working, then of course you can make me take some vaccine. Of course you can. So, I mean, because the autonomy of my body is not yours to infringe upon. So, but the first thing is say, look, I can go out of my house when I want to. This is not a situation where you can control my right of movement and my right of economic security. So the first thing is to say no about that.
It reminds me of it's crazy the way the human mind works. Like somebody will say something that reminds you of something, reminds you of something else. And I think that when something is fundamentally at its core true, it always sticks with you. And I remember years ago watching kind of Muppet sci-fi fantasy film, not really sci-fi fantasy film, called The Labyrinth with David Bowie. I don't know if you've ever come across
I
that.
didn't see that movie now.
You didn't see that. It's not a great movie, but it's a kind of thing that kids love to watch because it's got all the elements of good and bad and fantasy in it. And the main character has to come to the conclusion that the evil bad person has no power over them, and it's
Mm-hmm.
not. It's it's as if the belief that somebody has power over you is some kind of magic spell, and the character all through the film, the character is just trying to come to terms with understanding that you have no power over me, and breaking this spell that seems
Well, I mean,
to
it's a
exist.
common theme in movies. I mean, whether you're talking about The Wizard of Oz,
Hmm.
when Dorothy always had the power to click her heels and be back home whenever she
Yeah.
wanted to, whether you're talking about The Matrix, when you have a
Hmm.
certain level of consciousness that you can just see and the bullets just fall on the
Yep.
floor. So it's a constant theme that, yes, the mental birdcage, the psychological control is the big thing. And
Hmm.
when you look at when you get beyond the psychological control, then you see the wizard behind the curtain. You see him for the little man that he is, who's creating this big lightning and thunder and hologram, but he's just a little man. And that's when you look at a guy like Bill Gates and you understand the eugenic ideology that's driven him in his whole life, that's driven him through his father, who was a eugenicist, and you understand what eugenics is, then the whole mystery falls apart, You understand what the role of vaccines is and has been and how they're used, how they've been used as weapons in Africa, not now, but for decades. Then you understand what their HIV prevention drugs in Africa was all about. You realize, no, you're not trying to help them. Your ability to, for example, uh, diagnose a disease without any tests. So, for example, the same way coronavirus is being diagnosed without necessarily the test, symptom-based diagnoses is the exact way that AIDS was diagnosed in Africa, which meant that they wouldn't get clean water, but they can get free HIV drugs, which had the effect of destroying your immune system, resulting in the very same condition that you're saying you're trying to prevent. So when you understand the history of the more knowledge you have, and especially when you understand the motivation, which is eugenics, then it's of course that's what they'll do. Of course that's what they'll say. Of course these will be the measures. Of course you'll tell idiots around the world that going out and getting fresh air and going into the sun is not the most positive thing you can do for your health. That staying at home with recycled air is somehow better for you than going out into the vitamin D enriching sun. That and they'll believe it. Well, it's kind of like an IQ test. Like if you're stupid enough to believe that, then you're stupid enough to fall off the planet the way that I'm talking about, because you're just not smart enough to cut it. Just unfortunately, like the way that millions and millions and millions of parents allow their kids to be vaccinated for a sexually transmitted disease the very first day that they're born, and allow it. If you're stupid enough to do that, and then get another test, the vaccine the third day of life, and then get 5 vaccines the third month of life, if you're stupid enough to allow that, well, maybe then you shouldn't have kids. Maybe then the kids should be damaged, because what happens when you have those vaccine damaged kids? They have special needs. Usually it's so difficult to raise those kids that you cause marital conflict raising kids with special needs. You don't want to have more kids because you're drained taking care of these kids. And that serves as population control. The marriages may not even survive having real special needs kids. You're certainly not going to have 20 special needs kids, 8, 10, like an average. Oh, Kenya, the average woman has 8 kids. You're not going to have 8 special needs kids. You're not, especially so by doing this, by damaging, it is population control.
Mm-hmm. It's interesting the language they use. It is prevention, but it's not preventing what you think it's preventing.
Exactly, because once again, but when you understand what the ideology is, what the goals are, what their utopia is, why they keep showing that, oh, this city has a 25 less pollution than it had 2 months ago. These animals are now running around in the streets like they never did a month ago or 2 months ago. They're telling you that you are the virus. Yeah. That you are the virus. That look how clean the air would be without you. Look how clean the water would be without you. Look how the animals would be free to run around. How beautiful it would be without you. While you don't work, you don't earn a living, maybe you don't eat, maybe you don't live, but those billionaires, they will last. They will have the money. They'll lock down. Who knows how long we're going to lock down? Because they can lock down for years. They can live on a yacht for years. They can live in underground bunkers that are 5-star hotels for years. This doesn't apply to them.
We covered at the beginning of our conversation a little bit about whether or not people were planning something like this. I get the feeling that what I would call the human elements of society, people who are, say, watching the watchers. I think we need people to watch what people are doing, sort of just to make sure that they're not doing something nefarious sometimes. But I get the feeling that the liberty elements of society were caught off guard by this, that a lot of people weren't expecting this problem to hit with the speed and force at which it hit. Do you think people were caught off guard?
Well, I think everybody was caught off guard. I mean, I'm somebody who has been looking at these matters for about 20 years.
Mm-hmm.
I'm somebody who, for example, left the United States almost 20 years ago because of what I saw was happening.
Mm-hmm.
And I've been posting on this, whether I had a website where I post on this, I post on Facebook religiously every day, multiple articles about these kinds of issues. And as I said, I don't think anybody realized that it would be such a global grasp, such a global grasp of not just one country, but of almost the entire world. So the coordination has to be unprecedented. So I'm somebody who was watching the watchers. I'm somebody who's watching the social controllers. I'm somebody who's trying to wake people up for a long time. Literally 10 years ago, I went to Norway and was giving a talk called The Long Road to Death
Mm-hmm.
about these very issues, about this fascism, about this eugenics, about these vaccines, the very same thing.
Mm-hmm.
And yet, who could have recognized, like I said in the beginning, that they would shut down the entire aviation industry, that all the borders of the world would be shutting down and closing up? It's pretty breathtaking. So that's the biggest shocker. The
Absolutely.
planetary grab.
I think there's a certain intuition that people have that they haven't really been in touch with. I think in terms of dealing with problems for a while. I think if we ask ourselves to stop for a second, is this okay? Are you deep down inside? Are you okay with this? I think a lot of people are going to have to, answer that they're really not with it, and people exactly know that there's something wrong. In terms of what you said about fighting it for a long period of time and giving speeches, I felt about 3 to 5 years ago, I felt a shift, and something in my gut said, sell your house, put your business online, make yourself as independent as possible, because things are not going to stay this way. I could see a narrative evolving. I didn't know what it was. I didn't know what the result was going to be, but I knew what I had to do in order to prepare for it as much as possible. And I definitely, although I was monitoring what underground news networks were saying in terms of chatter like 5-6 months ago, there was there were stories pinging around, as they do, that this might be one of the directions that society takes. But sometimes you don't. Sometimes we don't even get past our own wanting to believe that, oh my God, it can't happen, and then it does, and then we're left trying to reverse the process that we shouldn't have followed in the first place. And I'm also not sure that we've actually really had to face exactly this kind of problem before, which to me is some kind of medical tyranny, where
But what I'm saying is that these people have been working long and hard for this medical tyranny. And if you look at the term scientific dictatorship, you would find people talking about scientific dictatorship as far back as now almost 75 years ago. And it operating very much like this.
Has the USA fallen already?
Yeah, the USA has fallen completely, but most places have fallen right now. Now it's really the rise of the, not 1%, because it's much smaller percentage than the 1%, but now it's the rise of the billionaires and the rise of the billionaires. That's really what it is. And so, if you're a millionaire, you're in trouble. You're in trouble.
Wow. One of the feelings I get from a lot of the articles that I read, some of which are completely biased, suggest that Trump is forming some kind of resistance against what is happening and trying to hold on to certain elements of what I would call traditional American values.
Yeah, he
Is he
may
doing?
be.
Yeah.
He may be. I mean, I think that from my understanding of events and my perspective of it, he's never been somebody that the CIA has wanted to be in that position. So from the very start, as soon as he won the election, they were saying that there was Russian interference, which was kind of propaganda, that he somehow stole the election well before he was even inaugurated, and he's never had a break to be the president. So yes, I think that he is, as I say, when he says he wants to open up the economy, that is resistance to what these scientific dictators want. And so, of course he is. But you're living in such a globally bombarded media space with propaganda that people are just so quick to categorize him as an idiot or the tyrant, a fascist, and people are just willing to repeat it. So I think, yeah, he's trying, but so long as the mental birdcage covers millions and millions of people's heads, he's in a very precarious space because, if he says we need to get back to work, then the echoing media says he's ready to kill Americans. He's ready to kill everybody. He's reckless. He's dangerous. And so it's hard to operate in that space. And these numbers, these coronavirus numbers, are fabricated and unreliable, but they can be controlled. So let's say if you're in a country and a country like the United States, and they just want to keep stacking the numbers and putting them up, then it'll make you look like you're presiding over this collapsing country, people just dying from coronavirus like flies. And so is he able to control those numbers? I don't think so. I don't think he's controlling those numbers. So when you control the numbers, you control the virus. When you control the virus, you control the fear. And what we're in the space where he's having to try to wake people up when they're constantly being bombarded by propaganda.
Absolutely. I think it's very hard to get, with any big project, it's hard to get a global planetary project. It's hard to get all of the ducks in a row. And we've seen some countries not following suit with the complete lockdowns. Of course, everybody's heard about Sweden, but Sweden's not the only country, right?
It's the most respected country.
Yep, which is why it must be crushed.
Plus it's the kind of this, when you think of this prototypically in this fascist model, in the fascist mindset, the Aryans, the blonde-haired, blue-eyes, were always the supermen. So in the fascist mindset, a country like Sweden was always the apex. So the fact that you have Sweden not following along, you can't say these are kind of redneck, hillbilly, Bible thumping idiots from Mobile, Mississippi, Mobile, Alabama, or whatever, Biloxi, Mississippi. No. Oh, the Swedes. So it's like, wow, the Swedes, they're not doing it. So it has a very different resonance than when Belarus doesn't do it. When Belarus doesn't do it, oh, that's Europe's last dictator. So, he's just drink vodka, go to the sauna, and everything will be fine. Okay, he's an idiot. The people in Mississippi or Alabama, they're idiots. When you have Sweden, it has a certain level of respect. So Sweden is the standout because nobody's going to just shit on Sweden like they're just idiots. So that's why when you have, America being locked down or other places being locked down, you don't want a Sweden saying, well, we're just going to go to the cafe, go to the restaurants like we've been doing, and we're okay. Because it shows more than anything how unnecessary your draconian measures were and are. So many places may do it, but it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter what those other countries do it when a country that is held in such reverence as Sweden does it. The Nordic country, oh, they're better there. Look at their education system, blah, 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 blah. So when they don't do that repressive measures, it's hard to say, well, we have to do it. It's completely necessary. Well, maybe not.
Yeah, it's a puzzle for me to try to put all the pieces together. Um, can I go through a couple more questions with you? Do you have time for
Yeah.
two or three
Okay.
more questions? Okay, super. That's great. Something that's been on my mind is, so I called my dentist the other day, and welcome to the real world. The dentist has been closed for 3 weeks and has no um, signs of opening up. Don't know when they're going to reopen. So basically nobody in this area or around any other dentist can go to the dentist in terms of healthcare. What is that doing to society? I mean, just the shutdown of that one element that's a fundamental health provider for society. When you shut down people's fundament access to fundamental health, which is generally necessary or extremely necessary for most people, because most people don't like to go to the dentist anyway, so they only go because they need to go. And yet the people across this country of Britain, where I am right now, are denied access to all forms of basic health care. The schools are shut down, which has puzzled me, because I would have thought that if there was some kind of authoritarian people in power, they would like to grab the kids and keep them away from the families and educate them in a certain way so they only think in one way. But what's going on there with the schools? Because the schools are shut down, and you can actually frame it in a positive light and say, well, kids get to spend more time with their families, and it's a chance to reconnect and
Well,
stuff.
because
So,
I don't think that's a good thing. Number one, I think that the education system is pretty bad all around, but
mhm.
there is a real desire to have a pretty much dumbed down society. And so I'm not a big fan of this educational system, but what you're dealing with now is you're putting kids at home with people that are being economically deprived of their opportunity to make a living, people that have never spent so much time together at home.
Mhm.
So there's no reason to think that now this is some healthy environment for kids' educational
Uh-huh.
opportunities, that domestic violence is going to increase, the deprivation of rights is going to have, people maybe are going to be drinking more, maybe these people are not trained to teach their kids.
Mm.
So I think that kids are going to be placed in a very, very difficult spot, even
Yeah.
though I'm not a big fan of the educational system. I think that, what are they going to do? They're probably going to spend a lot of time playing video games. They're going to be spending a lot of time, on their smartphones and things like this, and getting to know each other in very, very difficult contexts of, of having less
Well,
income, less to no income.
mm. Yeah, and one thing that crossed my mind was that the 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 programming that children are getting because of this, where children are having to normalize something that is completely abnormal. And when you at a young age normalize something like lockdown, normalize something like no contact, normalize something like not going out, normalize something like not being able to communicate with people, I find that quite frightening.
And that's what they're doing. This is what they're training people to do. They're training a new normal.
Mm,
They're
yeah.
training people to, to go down to a dark place. And every time you look at the news, they're telling you it's going to last long. They're not going back. And the conditions for your release are going to be severe.
Yeah, I said that I had a line in the sand, um, personally, and because I think that everyone has to draw a line and say enough's enough, right? And my line in the sand was when the government says to the surfers, look, you can't surf, because that, I don't think you can even argue with that. I don't think you can even present any kind of rational or even irrational argument for the fact that surfing is in any way dangerous to anybody. And a couple of days ago, the what's called the RNLI, the Royal National Lifeboat Institute, issued a statement saying they're strongly advising people not to surf and go out and do activities in the water. The level of absurdity to which we
Yeah, but you say
subject
draw a line in the
ourselves.
sand when they say it. It doesn't change anything. I mean, what's the consequence for them doing this?
Oh yeah,
Prohibiting
yeah,
it.
yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's
I
my
mean, we
land.
have to. It has to. We have to. It has to be some kind of reaction
Yeah,
when
yeah,
they're.
it's my line in the sand for me where I said, okay, I'm going to do everything I can to push back in the opposite direction,
Yeah, well, I think
as
people
much
need
as I can.
to. People really need to push back because it should have been obvious from the start. It should have been obvious from the start. Like it just is
Mm,
a certain level of absurdity, but for the whole thing, it should have been obvious that
okay.
this is no way related to health. It's no way related to your protection, and people need to systematically push back. The
Yeah,
only way we're going to get out of this is if people wake up more. And people are waking up. People need to wake up and push back. And then where they need to push back is they need to go out of the house in an organized manner and say, no, we're not staying home. We're not staying home. And we're not afraid.
yeah, absolutely. It's time. It's beyond time. It's past time to go out and make a difference in terms of what's happening around and
Yeah, to
about.
throw away, to put away your masks, to put away all the masks, all the shit, to put away your rubber gloves, and to say, I'm not afraid. If you
Yeah, I
do
don't.
that, if you put away the mask, you put away the rubber gloves, you hug somebody, you shake their hand, and you say, "Fuck this," and you join together, then it would stop.
Absolutely. Let's let's conclude with a quote and a comment here. I read a Spectator article the other day. It was an interview with a gentleman called Lord Sumption or Sumpton. I'm not exactly sure of the pronunciation.
Uh,
And sometimes you read something and it resonates and it makes sense. I'm
mm-hmm.
going to read it to you. And this is what he said. He was interviewed the other day and he said, the real problem is that when human societies lose their freedom, it's not usually because tyrants have taken it away. It's usually because people willingly surrender their freedom in return for protection against some external threat. And the threat is usually a real threat, but usually exaggerated. That's what I fear we are seeing now. The pressure on politicians has come from the public. They want action. They don't pause to ask whether the action will work. They don't ask themselves whether the cost will be worth paying. They want action anyway. And anyone who has studied history will recognize here the classic symptoms of collective hysteria. Hysteria is infectious. We are all working ourselves up into a lather in which we exaggerate the threat and stop asking ourselves whether the cure may be worse than the disease.
No, I agree with that.
Yeah, me too. Me too. I read that and I was like, wow, what? I just wish everybody could could see it as clearly as that.
Yeah, I mean, we're living in a space where, like when we were talking about the power of nightmares, is that the politicians have nothing left to offer but fear. They have nothing left to offer but fear. And if people recognize that, and they would go a long way towards breaking this mental birdcage. There's nothing, they don't need workers for the factories. They have people in India, they have people in China. There's no blue collar like there used to be generations ago. Things are getting automated every single day. They don't need the people, and they don't want the people. They don't need them. They don't want them. They're not doing things for their health. They're not. This is not for your security or for your safety. It's for your eradication. And people, if they understood that, they could respond appropriately. If they knew the history of vaccines, they knew the harm caused vaccines, they would know that this, my dear, is not my answer. This is not my salvation. This is not going to make me healthier. And if they knew that, they would realize that all of these people know that. All these Andrew Cuomo's and Gavin Newsom's, they know that. They get their fucking press conferences. They're not wearing masks and wearing gloves and social distancing. They know it's not what they're portraying. They are liars. And their lying has financial benefit. They are getting paid for lying.
Absolutely. And from my work with psychology, I have this personal fear that if somebody lets an individual or a group of people abuse them, the abuser gets stronger, doesn't stop, and just continues with more and more and
Of
more
course,
and
and that's
more.
what happened when you saw from 9/11. The reason why they're doing this is because there was no accountability for 9/11. So this is a result of that abuse. This is a result of the lack of accountability for 9/11, and that is a direct cost of people's passivity, their laziness, and their fear. They did not hold the people accountable, and this is what comes up. So it's not an accident, and it's not about a virus. It's about people's inability to hold the people responsible for 9/11 accountable. They lost freedoms then, and they're losing much more now. It is direct correlation.
Wow. Wow. Well said. Stephen, I want to thank you very much for your time this morning. I also want to say that you're a real gentleman, and I very much enjoy your scholarly approach to the topic that we've discussed. I hope to get this out to as many people as possible. If people want to follow you, they can do that through Facebook
Just
or.
Facebook, yeah. I just put my stuff on Facebook. I used to have other sites, but now I just post on Facebook.
Okay, super cool. So thank you very much for your time. I'm just so appreciative of it, and I very much hope that maybe we'll do a post-interview little chat and see if we can arrange maybe something slightly, maybe regularly, in order to have a little
Okay, that sounds
discussion
good.
about what is going on around and about. Because
No problem.
you've helped clear up my mind about certain things, and I'm sure if it's helpful to me, it can also be helpful to other people
That's
as
great.
well. So thank you very much. I'm gonna hit stop on the video, and I'm not sure
Uh-huh.
what's going to happen. I'm not sure if it's going to cut us off or if we'll be able
Oh,
to
it should
continue
cut us
talking.
off, and then we can
Well,
talk on Skype if you want.
we can do that. I'm going to hit stop. We're going to see what happens. Okay. Okay. Thank you very much, mate.